you've published a certain amount, it's something that it's, you know, you have to have a significant time commitment. And so that's obviously hard for many people. But on the other hand, it's something where once you have some publishing experience, you can really make a difference in a lot of people's careers. And for me, as I talk about, you know, making sure that we don't replicate, this is still a male-dominated field, and that we, you know, we try to do better with that. It's important, I think, to step up and say, I'm going to try to make some of that change, I think. And I was told, you know, when I was asked to apply for this position, I checked in with people who I trust about sort of career advancement, and they felt, and I think it's right, that sort of, you know, as a tenured professor, that's a good time to be on an editorial board, to be an associate editor, and to think that through it does give you the opportunity to have correspondence with many, many submitting authors and referees, and to sort of have that ongoing conversation with the field quite broadly in ways that I find quite interesting, and hopefully have some ability to make a positive impact.
Great, thanks so much, Becky. So we've left ourselves, thanks to the editors, we've left ourselves with about half an hour for questions. You can post your questions into the chat section and I can read those, or you can just unmute and ask your question aloud. Benjamin, I can read your question, or maybe if you want, you can just pose it to the editors.
Sure, I can pose it. Great. So I heard Rose speak to the idea of framing, and I think I've heard her speak of that a little before, but the other editors I've never seen speak before about this issue. I was hoping you could speak about your journal, BJIR, and then Work and Employment, about the importance of framing, and then also speak about the choice of methods, because I know some journals are a little more methods agnostic, perhaps, but others, you know, might have favored methods, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Benjamin.
Should I go, Dan, or do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks for your question. I think that the best framing for our journal is to let us know where your work fits in the literature and where your work fits in the world. You can't do one without the other. If you tell me just about the literature and you found a hole, that's not sufficient. If you tell me about the literature and tell me why the whole is important and what it means for the world of work, then suddenly I begin to care. So the proper framing should include both. The second question had to do with methodology. Our standard is we like to have people show us some important evidence that we think is generalizable and contributes to the field and will maybe show the test of time. But we recognize that that can be done in many different ways. So the BJIR has published typical multivariate statistics. It's published a lot of qualitative work where we think that's very important work. It's also published the occasional experiment. So, you know, I think, I don't know if we're agnostic, but we're broad in what we think can contribute evidence.
Great, thanks, John. Dan?
Good questions, Benjamin. Just regarding the methodological issue, as I mentioned earlier, we publish all qualitative and quantitative methods known to social scientists. So we're not methodologically fetishistic in any way. Regarding the framing issue, again, getting back to Rose's important distinction between a problem-driven versus a theory or disciplinary-driven kind of journal, framing for work and occupations has to do with the critical engagement of the scholarly community that is working on the same set of kind of theoretical and substantive issues that the author is trying to contribute to and move that field forward. And so what that means, primarily the literature review does have to demonstrate a so-called gap in the literature, and then it also has to show that filling the gap will move the field forward in a theoretical sense, and hopefully in a problem-solving sense as well. But given that the audience of work and occupations is primarily a kind of scholarly, theoretically driven type of audience, as opposed to the problem-centered type of audience, the contribution has to be demonstrated with respect to the research that has gone on before the author, that the author is building on explicitly. And as I said before, the kinds of innovations, framing, I think in the way that you're asking about it, the kinds of innovations that are made in work and occupations, and I think the same is true, by the way, for ILR and BJIR as well, but that I mentioned earlier, creating a new typology, for example, using inductive methods, like if you had a comparative city analysis of new ways of thinking about a legacy of labor management relations that's employer-centric, and you develop a method for looking at the implications of that for healthcare organizing today, that is creating a new typology and advancing the field in a way that the reviewers and the editor feel is important for the advancement of that field. And so that's usually a judgment call that emerges through the peer review process. And then hypothesis testing, if it's the same old hypothesis over and over again, then no one really cares about that. That would not be considered all that innovative, even if it's rigorous. But specifying a new model for something using deductive methods and hypothesis testing with an independent variable that hasn't been done before, and the reviewers end up thinking that, yeah, that's going to really advance the field. We hadn't thought of that hypothesis. That's the kind of framing, so to speak, that we would be looking for. Finally, another type of innovation that would appeal to the scholarly community served by this journal would be looking at the generalizability of reigning theories or concepts or typologies, whatever, across different subgroups, subpopulations. And so if, let's say you have some theory that has been developed primarily in the West, and we have many international submitters to our journal, and they say, well, you know, that's a Western derived theory. Let's see how applicable it might be in a different country outside of the West, wherever that might be. That's another way to innovate for the scholarly community. That's looking at the generalizability of theories across different parts of the world, or demographic groups within a country or whatever. Does that get at what you were asking about?
Right, thanks, Dan. Rose or Becky, do you want to add to this question, or we can go on to Johnny's question? Great. So Johnny's asking a question specific to PhD students. Johnny is a PhD student here at Cornell and already published in Work and Occupations, I should say, given this session, and asking about placing a manuscript, or what advice do the editors have in terms of considering where to place a manuscript. And Johnny, if there's anything you want to add to that question, feel free to unmute.
No, that's it. Thanks, Ariel.
Go ahead, Becky.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Thanks for your question, Johnny. I think it's an important one. I think in the current version of graduate education and that career stage, it's considered, I kind of want to say, essential to have a publication before applying, at least for tenure track jobs. And so it's a very front of mind concern for many graduate students. and you sort of asked about whether relying on your advisors, that's the best place to get advice, I would say, but not the only place to get advice. And the piece of due diligence, I guess I'd suggest you do, is look at places where you might like a job or where you might realistically get a job, right? So you might have ideas about the best place to get a job, but you also might have places where realistically there will be more jobs, whether that's, slightly different disciplines. If you're in a discipline, an interdisciplinary field, for people in our broader community, some are looking in business schools, and different, this is not something I love to talk about or think about, but different ranks and tiers of schools will take on different things differently. So, there might be something where, do you want to pitch it to a top industrial relations journal, or if you think you're going to be going on a business school job market, maybe a business school journal, even if it's not a top business school journal, might have some advantages, right? Something, and same with international thoughts, right? So some journals that are a little narrower in regions or countries or other parts of the world are going to be just fine if you're applying for a job in that region or country or part of the world, right? So I think looking at what will be helpful for where you might, plan or hope to get a job, not just where your advisors suggest, which is going to be influenced by where they have most fruitfully published, right? And your career is not going to follow the same path as even your most trusted, helpful advisors. So I think looking around and thinking about those other concerns as well might be a useful way to go.
I turn it to Rose, John, or Dan, and also maybe as you respond to Johnny's question, Allison has asked a question about what's appropriate or what are appropriate ways to engage with editors during the submission process or leading up to the submission process, so we can maybe bundle those questions.
I can, yeah, in
Go ahead,
terms
Rose.
of, I agree with a lot of what Becky said on choice. I think you have to figure out kind of what your identity is and who your community is, and then really engage with that community, because that is going to be your career. And I would just say that the problem that I've had and a lot of people in IR is that we are trained in industrial relations or the sociology of work, and then we get jobs in management department, and we are pressured to publish in business journals, the Academy of Management, blah, blah, blah. And we, in order to get tenure, and I've had to kind of have this schizophrenic personality where the work I love was always in IR journals, and the work I had to do was in top management journals in order to get recognition. And that's kind of double and triple work. But ultimately, if you want to stay true to yourself, I think it's important to identify your true community. And then if you have to do this stuff to, and I had to make sure that the work I published in the management journals was work I believed in. It usually was around making the business case for certain management practices. But it is, I think, schizophrenic for people who are in our world, where we really value trying to make better the world. So we do empirically based research, objective, but it has a normative underpinning. The choices we make are also normative. So I think it's difficult, but I would start there. But you may have to publish in places where you might not be your first choice, but you do have to keep your job. The other issue about engaging with editors, I would just say a little bit, over time, I've become more open to talking with authors, looking at something ahead of time. And I think maybe the field has moved in this direction, that we're not quite as, remote in, you submit it and I'm not going to talk to you. And, but I've done a couple of things. First of all, I think in terms of increasing breadth of who is in the journal, I completely agree with what Becky was saying. I've had to, the way I've done it is through special issues, which bring in people who've never had a chance to publish in the journal, and then do a huge amount of developmental work, because there's this gap between perhaps how the person was trained and what the standards of the journal are, and somehow you have to kind of reconcile them, not with taking away in any way the author's perspective, but certainly making sure the standards of empirical evidence, et cetera, match. So you spend a lot of time as an editor if you want to bring on board people who were trained in different traditions. The other thing I've done is what I call a reject and resubmit. So I'll say to someone, you know, this has really got potential. The data is really good, the idea is good, but this manuscript itself just is not going to cut it. If I send it to the reviewers, no. And so I will give detailed feedback on how to revise something in a way that I think will then be able to be submitted through the review process. So I've done quite a bit more of that over time. But it takes, if you got a lot of manuscript you're processing, it also takes a lot of time of the associate editors as well as the editor.
Thanks, Rose. John or Dan, do you want to add to this question? And we have a couple of new questions as well if we want to turn to those.
Just reiterate in slightly different words what Rose said, which is, I think when choosing a journal, you really want to think about what it is you want to say and who you want to say it to. And that may be the same as choosing your community. And I think as an economist, my discipline faces the same problem, which is lots of economists don't really care about IR. But I view myself as a crusader. And I think those of us who are in IR should do the same, to say that we can contribute to our discipline through participating in an interdisciplinary field.
Dan?
I don't have much to add. I agree with everything that's been said. And it is an existential issue, first and foremost, meaning that it's an authorial decision about who am I? And that's the community issue. Where do I belong and who do I want to engage, period. There is, after that, you know, there are more instrumental concerns. I have seen, and I consider this to be an abuse, where the choice of a journal is based on its impact factor. And there's a lot of that obviously going on. The whole process of promotion has become driven by this, and it's negative currency as far as I'm concerned. And so, and work and occupations, at least this year, seems to be doing just fine when it comes to its impact factor. These things bounce around a lot, so I'm not going to hold my breath here, but try to remain as close to your sense of self rather than commodifying yourself as an author into some kind of trivial marketplace that's purely driven by instrumentalism.
So that might be a good segue to, in some ways, to Justin's question about the trade-off between where the journal, the level of the journal, or the authorship order. I don't know if any of you have thoughts on authorship order or where this is where the article is being placed.
I'll tell a short, hopefully funny story about authorship order. I had two friends who worked together their entire life. They always alphabetized their name. And at the very end of their long career of working together, the one whose name came second in the alphabet decided he should be first. And so reluctantly, they agreed to reverse. The one who became first, suddenly everyone started thinking that perhaps he hadn't contributed fully for the first 99 articles they'd written together. I don't think it's very important, the author's order, at least in industrial relations. I think you should worry about who you're talking to and what you have to say.
I can,
Becky?
I'll just jump in and say, It could matter a little bit. And if you've got a long list of authors and it's going to be referred to as, you know, Batt et al, and the other names will be dissolved into an et al. But realistically, when you're being evaluated for a job application, tenure, promotion, et cetera, there's going to be an opportunity to be much more explicit. So for instance, if you're not an economist, but you publish with some economists, you can mention that economics almost always uses alphabetical, but this is my contribution and this is the other's contribution to the paper. You don't come across, you know, whether it's a recommendation letter for a job applicant or a tenure packet that the person is writing about themselves that isn't a little bit more specific about the contributions, and in many places actually backed up by a sort of affirmation of that by the co-authors. So I wouldn't worry too much about author, but I would worry about contribution, right? And so as you're carving out your career, you want to be in a leadership role in some things and not other things. I think that shows that you have original thoughts, you've done original research, but also you're a collaborative person and you're someone who is eager to be involved even when you're not in the driving seat. So I think having a mix is good. And I think in terms of how the names are listed when you're published, anything that's consequential, you'll have an opportunity to explain what everyone's contribution was. And so you don't need to worry as much about that. And I'll say senior people in the field, I would say have the obligation to be generous, right? And to think about whether they elevate someone to a co-author or acknowledge them as a research assistant, whether they let them take the lead where they could and they can decide it during the process. So I think that's on more established folks in the field to make sure that part of training and mentoring is being generous to people that aren't as far along in their careers.
Great. Rose?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said, Becky, but where I worry is, well, first of all, I think the conversation about authorship has to start as soon as you decide to do something together and you set down some rules and you basically say, okay, the person who puts in the most, you know, if there's equal, then we can do it alphabetically, but if there's someone who really is seriously taking the lead, then that person should go first. And that you revisit that, because I've been in situations, or I know of situations in which someone says, I'm going to be the lead, and then is the bottleneck and the paper never gets written, or it takes 6 months or a year or whatever, and then you have to step in, but you don't reverse order on the authorship when really you're the one who got that paper to be submitted. So that's one issue. The other is definitely worrying about writing with senior faculty and attribution if you're a woman, or attribution if you're a Black or a junior person. In any of those categories, the attribution will not go to you. And so writing a lot with your senior advisor. I mean, I have seen that a lot in tenure cases where it's like, well, you know, 5 articles with your senior faculty member. What is this? What's your contribution, even if you say so? So I think all of those kinds of issues have to be explicit in your mind, and you need to think it through. And as much as I would like to say that all of our faculty, senior faculty, are generous, they're not. they're just not. And you've got people who say, oh, I've got this great data set that you can work on, right? And it's like, yeah, well, I haven't been able to figure it out, so I want to jump it on you. So I do think you need to be skeptical about senior faculty, and also data sets that are gifts to you, and then how you handle that.
Thanks, Rose. Dan?
I agree with everything that's been said. I would add that at least in sociology, there's variation in terms of collaboration versus solo authorship. And so in our discipline, we do both. Some people collaborate and others are more solo book writers, even, you know, even outside of the whole realm here. And so that partly is reflected in the whole PhD training process. So many sociology departments have at least multiple training models. One is the shop model, which is where, as Rose said, the senior person's got a big data set and invites a doctoral student to, take a piece of it for themselves to write it up. And the other model is where the student just does their own project. And in my field, when it comes to promotions and whatnot, like your field, it's the originality and intellectual leadership that the candidate always has to prove. And so the more solo you can become, the easier it is for you to prove. That's not to say that collaboration is bad. But for example, in my department at Vanderbilt, we actively discourage junior people from publishing with senior people in our department. And certainly we discourage the junior tenure track faculty from publishing with anyone on their dissertation committee. So whatever kind of arrangement you make, it should be fair, and let's give credit where credit is due. And the junior person should always put themselves in a situation where they can demonstrate their intellectual leadership, and the senior people should obviously honor that.
Great, thanks, Dan. John, in your remarks, you talked about the large number of desk rejects that your journal sends out, and Kijong is asking a question about frequent reasons for rejections, including desk rejects. You've all touched on some of those, but I wonder if there are other sort of buckets or categories that you want to talk about in terms of rejections, both desk rejects and rejections after the review process.
Well, I'll start by saying again that I think the most common reason I desk reject is because something is not framed well for our journal. It's too narrow. It's speaking only to one discipline, and that can be economics, that can be OB, that can be whatever. So that's probably the most common reason. The second most common reason is probably the contribution is honestly hard to identify. It might be there, but if it's hard to identify, if I can't identify it after looking at it for 5 or 10 minutes, then it's probably not going to get by the door. And I don't always make these decisions alone. Sometimes, as Becky knows, I'll send something to her and say, gosh, this is out of my area. It's qualitative work, but is there something good here or not? So it's those first 2 pages that Rose was talking about. Can you convince me that you've got something that's important for the literature and something that's important for the real world?
Great.
I would just add, I agree with it. Narrowness, we have a broad audience. So if something is so narrow and it speaks to one country or it's got to be framed so that it addresses bigger issues. And sometimes the author just doesn't see that. And so that's where sometimes I say, you've got great data, but you got to frame it different. So then maybe reject and resubmit. But the other issue is, the empirical evidence has to be there. So if there's good stuff there, but if there's a single case study with 15 interviews, that's a desk reject. I mean, you have to have that really solid empirical base to begin with before you can frame or do anything else with it.
So we have time, I think, for one more question, probably. We're almost out of time. I have one I've been thinking about, but I'll wait to see if others have questions. Feel free to unmute if you want to ask it yourself.
If there isn't a question, I would like to just reiterate one thing, which is, I think what Becky said about the diversity in our journals is just paramount. And I've been working really hard to figure out how to do that because we come from a labor economics, industrial relations tradition that is primarily white male and Western. And I've spent, you know, I've done it a lot through special issues, a lot by expanding my editorial board, a lot through talking to my editorial board and send me people who I can work with. When I was talking about working with people, you know, sometimes really creative people are used to writing books or book chapters. And so that's where I'm talking about. There's this whole process then of working with someone to translate their work into a journal format that meets, you know, the journal's criteria. So, but I do think we have to continue to work hard on expanding the junior people, the people doing work on gender, race, ethnicity, immigration, intersectionality. It's just critical to advancing our industry and our LIRA, which there's a lot of work being done along those lines as well.
Great, thanks. So we have 2 questions. I'll let the editors select which of these they want to touch on. Ellie's asking, Rose, you noted that 15 interviews in a single case is not enough. Ellie's asking, well, what's the rule of thumb for what might be enough in a qualitative case? That's a tough question to answer. And Helen is asking a question about data transparency. So I'll just turn it over to whichever one of these questions you want to answer with our remaining couple of minutes.
I'll say something very quickly about data transparency, only because our journal has just changed its view. We're now changed to a category where basically we expect you to share your data unless you can tell us why you can't. And I think increasingly that's becoming at least the minimum standard. And so I think transparency on data is critical. It doesn't matter, you know, what the data is, where the source is, but transparency is critical.
I'm happy to touch on Ellie's question about qualitative research. There is no magic cutoff point here. Rule of thumb might be 30 interviews, but don't hold me to that. The issue is not only the number, but rather if you have subgroupings that you're looking at, and then you start to slice them up, like you're comparing people of different races, comparing people of different ages, comparing people of different genders, or whatever the sample structure consists of, you need to have enough people within each cell of that structure to be able to generalize just from that cell. So the overall number is sometimes a rule of thumb, but if you're dealing with 3 dimensions of social identity in your sample and you're trying to talk about how people balance work and family or something like that, or whatever it is, you know, you need to, and you're saying, well, here's how young people from the Netherlands balance work and family versus here's how elderly people from another country, whatever it is, balance work and family. If you don't have enough interviewees in each of those categories, the total number doesn't matter. It's the number of people in the subgroupings that allow you to generalize at all or induce any kind of typology that matters.
So we are, oh, go ahead, Rose. Go ahead.
I'll just say I agree on both those points. Data transparency is huge right now because a lot of people are using proprietary data sets and those get really sticky.
Great, thank you. So we're formally out of time, but I think we have a couple minutes before the next session starts. I just want to thank Becky, Rose, John, and Dan for their insights. I know Joel, editor of Negotiation Journal, has a comment about data transparency.
Sure. It's actually less of a negotiations journal comment, but as Dan knows, I've been studying a new category of folks called data workers who run data repositories. and are the homes for data when you make it open and transparent, particularly in the sciences. And it turns out the work, and by the way, our journal, like many of the others, is looking for people to submit data with their articles, but there's quite a bit of work to submit not just a flat file that's not reusable, but to submit data with the supporting information so that it's not just for people to validate what you did, but to reuse it and combine it with others. And those fields and disciplines that are most advanced in open sharing of data are also advancing at a faster rate because of that. So I would say, you know, in negotiations, we're about to launch the negotiations data repository, but many other areas of industrial relations and conflict resolution do not have data repositories, and there's some institution building work for us to do.
Thank you, Joel. Thanks again for the editors for your time, and thanks for all the questions. This was another successful LIRA session, and I wish you an enjoyable rest of your LIRA virtual conference.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Ariel, for coordinating and running this so well. Thank you, Ariel.
Second that.
Thank you. Thanks to all for staying in here.
Thank you for having me.